Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. But at least 2 false witnesses came forward and said, "This fellow has said, I will destroy the temple of God and build it again in 3 days." That's interesting, and it gives us an interesting little lesson in how the Gospels just have the earmark, the bearings of eyewitness accounts. If you remember, we've talked about, what's his name, J. Warner Wallace, cold case detective. This is one of the things that led him, as he, as an atheist, was investigating the Gospels, that he looked at and said, this sounds true. Because one thing you would notice, right, we tend to have a habit of reading the Bible in little bits and pieces, but if you take the entire book of Matthew, you will find that nowhere in the book of Matthew does Jesus ever say anything about tearing down the temple and rebuilding it in 3 days. It's not in Matthew. So if all you have is Matthew, and Mark does the same thing, if all you have is Matthew and you're reading and someone says, "Oh, well, he said this," and you're thinking, well, where did Jesus say that? This is what's called an undesigned coincidence, where 2 books kind of share details that complement each other, because if you flip over to John 2, you don't have to go there, but in John 2:19 is where Jesus says, "You tear down this temple and I'll raise it again in 3 days." What's interesting is John doesn't record this part where the witnesses pointed out, but Matthew and Mark record the witnesses, but they don't actually record Jesus saying it. But when you take both of them together, you get the full picture. And this is exactly how eyewitness testimonies work, where they're giving the testimony of what they know, and someone else gives a testimony of what they know, and quite separate, independent of one another, not designed at all, the details fit together. That's how eyewitness accounts work. And so here we have a great example of that, and it just speaks to the reliability of the Gospels. The charge is blasphemy, right? But this isn't a legal trial. So they've heard his words, they've found him guilty, but this is not official. It is an illegal trial because the Sanhedrin cannot meet and hold a trial at night. And as we're about to see, they hold another trial in the morning, and until then, apparently, Jesus is held in custody by some guards, because in verse 67, we get this interesting tidbit, which is going to give us another example of how the gospel testimonies fit together. Verse 67 says, "Then the guards spat in his face and beat him, and others struck him with the palm of their hands, saying, 'Prophesy to us, Christ, who is the one who struck you?'" Now, why wouldn't he know who struck him? They're right there in front of him. I mean, couldn't he see? I mean, they're right there next to him, and they hit him. Well, the obvious answer is he must have been blindfolded or something. But here's the thing. Matthew does not tell us he's blindfolded. Doesn't mention it. But if you were to go over to Luke chapter 22, it tells us that he had a blindfold on, that he was bound and blindfolded, and that they struck him and said, "Ha ha, tell us, prophesy, who struck you?" And so here you have details in separate accounts that are making sense of one another to fill out the full picture. And the Gospels are full of such things.